The autumn of 1847 arrived with a biting cruelty, tearing through the river bottoms of southeast Texas with a ferocity that matched the turmoil of the fledgling republic. Historical records from the period suggest that the region was a patchwork of contested sovereignty, where the laws of the Republic of Texas struggled to assert dominance over the wilder, older laws of the plains. It was in this chaotic interstice that Silas, a man whose very existence was defined by the ledger books of the Thornwood plantation, committed an act of defiance that would ripple through the archival silence of the era. Having lived 26 years under the ownership of Cornelius Thorne, a man whose probate inventory would later list human beings alongside cattle and plows, Silas understood that the boundaries of his world were drawn in blood and ink. But on a night when the sky tore open over the Brazos River, drowning the trails in a deluge of mud and shadow, the carefully constructed order of the plantation began to fracture. He did not run merely toward the North Star that night. He ran from the suffocation of a future already written for him. Silas had spent his youth listening to the rhythms of the big house, learning the delicate art of invisibility that kept the enslaved alive. Yet, the recent harvest had brought a darkness to Thornwood that even the most dutiful submission could not ward off. Correspondence discovered years later in a trunk in Austin reveals the mounting debts that plagued Thorne, debts that threatened the sale of Silas's wife and children to satisfy creditors in New Orleans. This prospective severance, a common cruelty of the domestic trade, acted as the catalyst for his flight. He slipped away during the height of the storm, moving through the torrential rain that masked his scent from the bloodhounds, kept chained near the overseer's quarters. The storm was a temporary ally, a violent reprieve that turned the hard-packed roads into treacherous rivers. But Silas knew that once the clouds broke, the arithmetic of his survival would shift violently against him. By the third day, the mud had caked into his boots, weighing his steps as he pushed deeper into the scrub oak and mesquite thickets that bordered the Colorado River to the west. He navigated by instinct, and fragments of lore whispered in the slave quarters. Tales of the Monte Muerte, the mountains of death, where the laws of white men held no sway. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against him, the thorns tearing at his clothing like the grasping fingers of pursuers yet unseen. His water skin had run dry 2 suns prior, and the relentless Texas sun, now unleashed after the storm, beat down with a baking intensity that warped the horizon. Testimony from other runaways collected by abolitionist societies in later years often highlighted this initial period of exposure as the deadliest, where dehydration claimed more lives than the bullet or the whip. Silas, however, was sustained by a cold, hard resolve that had calcified over years of watching others sold south, a determination that pushed him forward when his body screamed for rest. The psychological weight of the hunt pressed upon him with an almost physical heaviness. Cornelius Thorne was not a man to accept the theft of his property lightly. He was known in the county ledgers as a relentless litigant and a brutal enforcer of discipline. The knowledge that professional slave catchers, men who tracked humans for the bounty of $250 a head, were surely on his trail added a frantic edge to Silas's movements. He traveled by night, guided by the stars he had learned to read in the rare moments of quiet on the plantation and sought shelter during the day in the densest thickets. The silence of the wilderness was a constant alarm, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of wind through the dry grass, sounds that could mask the approach of a mounted patrol. He was a foreigner in this land, a man traversing a terrain that belonged to the Comanche and the Kiowa, tribes whose reputation for ferocity was wielded by white masters to keep the enslaved fearful of flight. On the evening of the 5th day, the terrain shifted, rising into a broken landscape of limestone ridges and hidden ravines that offered both concealment and danger. Silas had crossed into a buffer zone, a no-man's land where the authority of the Republic of Texas was little more than a rumor. He was moving through a mesquite flat, the thorns scraping against his skin, when he stumbled upon a narrow game trail marked with signs of recent passage. The trail led toward a stand of cottonwoods, a promising indication of water, but the silence that hung over the area was unnatural, devoid of the chirping of insects or the chatter of birds. It was a silence that spoke of a predator, or perhaps something else entirely. Silas paused, crouching low in the brush, his senses straining against the oppressive quiet. He clutched a stolen iron rasp, the only weapon he possessed, tight against his chest, his breath coming in shallow, controlled rasps. It was then that the sound reached him, a low, guttural exhalation that was neither the wind nor the cry of a beast of prey. It was a sound of suffering, a wet, ragged noise that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Silas froze, every instinct warring within him. The smart choice, the choice of survival, was to retreat, to circle wide and avoid whatever struggle lay ahead. To approach was to risk alerting anyone else in the vicinity, or worse, to fall into a trap laid by the very men hunting him. Yet the sound came again, a moan of unmistakable human anguish. Against all logic, Silas found himself moving forward, pushed by a curiosity and a compassion that his years in bondage had not been able to extinguish. He parted the heavy mesquite branches, stepping into a small clearing, bathed in the amber light of the setting sun. Lying in the center of the clearing was a sight that halted Silas in his tracks. A massive iron bear trap, its jaws serrated and rusted, was clamped tight around the leg of a man. The victim was a Kiowa warrior, his bronze skin streaked with sweat and dried blood, his eyes closed in a state of semi-consciousness. The trap's teeth had shattered the bone just above the ankle, a catastrophic injury that condemned the man to a slow, agonizing death. The warrior's horse lay dead nearby, its throat cut by a hidden wire strung between the trees. A cruel addition to the trap designed to kill any mount and trap the rider. This was no ordinary hunting snare. It was a man-trap, an outlawed device used by ruthless pelt hunters and bounty men to catch their prey, human or animal, regardless of the law. Silas stood over the fallen warrior, the weight of his decision pressing down upon him. The Kiowa were the scourge of the frontier in the stories told by white men, painted as demons who rode out of the night to steal horses and lives. To help this man was to aid a supposed enemy, to burden himself with a liability that could slow him down and lead the slave-catchers right to him. Yet, as he looked at the warrior's face, twisted in pain, Silas saw the same iron logic of oppression that ruled his own life. The trap was a manifestation of a world that sought to bind and break those who dared to roam free. He knelt beside the warrior, noting the rise and fall of the man's chest, and realized that leaving him here would be an act of moral surrender he was not willing to commit. He set his rasp down on the ground and placed his hands on the heavy springs of the trap. The metal was slick with blood and heated by the sun, burning his palms. The warrior's eyes snapped open at the touch, dark and filled with a delirious fury. He gripped a knife at his belt, his hand trembling too violently to raise it effectively. Silas held the man's gaze, his voice a low, steady whisper. "I am not your enemy." He knew the words were likely incomprehensible, but he trusted the tone to bridge the gap between them. With a grunt of exertion that came from the very depths of his spirit, Silas threw his weight against the springs. The metal groaned in protest, fighting to stay closed, a mechanical reflection of the world that had forged it. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the trap held firm, a testament to the blacksmith's craft. Silas's muscles screamed, his own exhaustion threatening to undo him, but he thought of the ledgers in Thornwood's study, the lists of names and values, and he pushed harder. With a sudden, violent snap, the jaws sprang open. Silas immediately grabbed the warrior's leg, applying pressure to the mangled flesh to staunch the flow of blood. The warrior gasped, his body arching in pain before collapsing back against the earth. Silas worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to bind the wound, his hands moving with a skill learned from years of mending the broken bodies of his fellow enslaved. As he worked, the warrior whispered a single word in his own tongue, a sound that Silas would later learn meant brother, though in that moment he understood only the gratitude in the tone. The warrior, whose name Silas would learn was Walking Crow, drifted back into unconsciousness, leaving Silas alone with the weight of his choice. The clearing was silent once more, save for the buzzing of flies attracted to the blood. Silas looked at the trap lying open in the dirt, a monster defeated, and then at the man it had tried to consume. He knew he could not leave him here. The coyotes and vultures would find him within hours, or worse, the slave catchers would stumble upon him. He fashioned a rough travois from fallen branches and his own belt, a device that would allow him to drag the warrior. It was a burden that would slow him, perhaps fatally, but as Silas lifted the straps onto his shoulders, he felt a strange sense of liberation. He was no longer just a fugitive running from a master. He was a man walking toward a destiny of his own choosing. The burden of the travois transformed the rugged terrain into an agonizing obstacle course, each jagged rock and hidden root threatening to topple Silas and his charge. Historical analysis of the region's geography indicates that the limestone escarpments bordering the Colorado River created a natural maze, a landscape that favored those who knew its secrets over those fleeing in desperation. Silas, guided only by the stars and a desperate hope for water, navigated by moonlight, his body screaming in protest with every lurching step. The travois straps cut into his shoulders, rubbing the skin raw, but the rhythm of his movement became a mantra, a physical meditation that drowned out the pain. Walking Crow remained in a feverish stupor, his survival hanging by a thread, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that seemed to mock the vast silence of the plains. As the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, the physical toll of the journey began to manifest in dangerous ways. Silas's vision swam with exhaustion, the edges of his sight blurring into a hazy gray, that threatened to pull him down into the dust. He had not eaten in days, sustaining himself on nothing but willpower and the occasional handful of wild berries found in the scrub. The physiological limits of the human body were being tested, a fact documented in numerous slave narratives from the period, where flight often became a race against starvation as much as pursuit. Silas knew that if he collapsed now, neither he nor the warrior would rise again, their bones left to bleach under the relentless sun alongside the ruins of their hope. A low, guttural sound from the travois snapped Silas back to the present, sharper and more urgent than the previous moans. He stopped, lowering the poles carefully, and turned to find Walking Crow's eyes open, lucid for the first time since the trap. The warrior's gaze was devoid of the panic that often accompanies severe trauma, replaced instead by a calculating assessment of his surroundings and his savior. He tried to speak, his voice a cracked whisper, but the language barrier stood between them like a wall. Silas knelt beside him, offering the last of the water from his skin, a gesture that transcended words. The warrior drank sparingly, his eyes never leaving Silas's face, measuring the man who had chosen to save him. In that moment of shared silence, a profound shift occurred in the dynamic between the two men. Walking Crow reached into a leather pouch at his waist, his fingers fumbling with a weakness that belied his status, and withdrew a piece of turquoise set in battered silver. It was not a trade good or a trinket, but a personal totem, an object of spiritual weight that signaled identity and connection. With a trembling hand, he pressed it into Silas's palm, closing Silas's fingers over the stone. The gesture was a clear transference of obligation and alliance, a silent pact sealed in the dust of the frontier. Silas looked at the token, feeling its cool weight, and understood that he had been claimed by a bond as strong as any iron chain, yet chosen rather than forced. The gift of the totem marked a turning point, transforming their relationship from one of rescuer and victim to one of brothers in arms. Silas helped Walking Crow to sit up, propping him against a mesquite trunk to assess the wound in the daylight. The leg was swollen and angry, the infection threatening to spread beyond the initial injury. Silas knew that without proper herbs and clean water, the warrior would not survive another day in the heat. He scanned the horizon, looking for the telltale dark green of cottonwoods that would signify a water source. The landscape offered little hope, a sea of brown and grey stretching out under the climbing sun, but the totem in his pocket served as a talisman, a promise that he was not walking alone. Just as despair began to tighten its grip, a faint rustle in the brush to the north caught Silas's attention. He froze, his hand moving instinctively to the iron rasp at his belt, his body tensing for a confrontation. The sound was too rhythmic to be the wind, too heavy to be a snake or a coyote. He scanned the ridgeline, his heart hammering against his ribs as the threat of discovery loomed large. The fear of the slave catchers was a constant drumbeat in his mind, a phantom pressure that never truly faded. He positioned himself between the sound and the wounded warrior, ready to defend the man he had sworn to save, even if it meant sacrificing his own chance at freedom. To his immense relief, the source of the noise revealed itself not as a pursuer, but as a stray longhorn, a massive, matted beast that had wandered far from the scattered herds of the open range. The animal regarded them with dull curiosity, before shambling off toward a gully Silas had not noticed before. The steer's path pointed toward a break in the terrain, a hidden fold in the earth that promised shade and moisture. Silas exhaled, his breath shaking, and realized that the animal was a guide, a living marker in a landscape that seemed determined to hide its secrets. He quickly reshouldered the travois, ignoring the burning in his muscles, and steered their course to follow the longhorn's path. The gully opened up into a narrow canyon, a wound in the earth that had been carved by centuries of flash floods. At the bottom, a thin ribbon of water trickled over smooth stones, a miracle of hydrology in the arid scrub. Silas lowered the travois with a groan of relief, the sound of the water louder to his ears than any church bell. He helped Walking Crow to the edge of the stream, supporting the warrior's weight as he drank deeply. The water was cold and mineral-heavy, a tonic that seemed to restore a measure of life to both men. Silas washed the dried blood from his hands, watching the red current swirl away, a symbolic cleansing of the immediate past. While Walking Crow rested in the shade of a limestone overhang, Silas set about the task of making them defensible. He gathered fallen branches and brush, constructing a rough blind that would conceal them from the prying eyes of the ridgeline. The work was back-breaking, every movement a reminder of his exhaustion, but the fear of being caught in the open drove him onward. He knew that Cornelius Thorne would not simply let a piece of valuable property vanish into the night. The reward posted for Silas's capture, rumored to be $500, was enough to draw the most ruthless hunters in the territory. The canyon offered concealment, but it was also a trap of a different kind, a dead end if they were discovered. As night fell over the canyon, the temperature dropped sharply, the stone walls radiating the day's heat back into the cooling air. Silas gathered a small quantity of dry wood, enough for a tiny, smokeless fire, to ward off the chill and heat water for the warrior's wound. The darkness pressed in on them, alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their hunt. Sitting by the fire, Silas studied Walking Crow's face in the flickering light, seeing the strong lines of his jaw and the deep set of his eyes. The warrior was watching him in return, a silent communion passing between them. They were two men from worlds at war, thrown together by chance and cruelty, yet finding a common ground in the dust of the frontier. The next morning brought a sobering reality. Walking Crow's leg showed signs of the poison advancing, the red streaks of infection creeping upward. Silas knew that resting was no longer an option if the warrior was to survive. He needed to find plants with healing properties, knowledge he had gleaned from an old root doctor on the plantation. He scoured the canyon floor, searching for yarrow or plantain among the scrub, his hands tearing at the earth in frustration. The sheer scale of the task ahead weighed on him. He was a doctor, a nurse, and a guardian, all while being the prey in a high-stakes hunt. The internal pacing of his fear began to quicken, matching the desperate rhythm of his heart. His search for herbs yielded a meager harvest, but it was enough to create a poultice that might slow the infection. As he applied the mashed leaves to Walking Crow's leg, the warrior gripped his arm, pointing toward the southern sky. Silas followed the gesture and saw a faint wisp of smoke on the horizon, too straight and too steady to be a wildfire. It was a signal, a communication used by the native peoples of the plains. Walking Crow spoke a single word, his voice strained, but filled with a desperate hope. "Brother!" The signal fire meant that his people were looking for him, but whether they would offer salvation or death to the black man who had saved him remained an agonizing uncertainty. The signal smoke on the horizon acted as a beacon, transforming the vast and indifferent wilderness into a map of potential salvation. Silas understood that the column of white rising into the blue sky was a language he could not speak, a communication network that spanned the plains long before the telegraph poles of the white man began to scar the landscape. Walking Crow, though weakened by fever and blood loss, managed to convey through a series of hand gestures that the smoke originated from a scouting party of his own band, the Kiowa, who were actively searching for him. This revelation shifted Silas's trajectory. He was no longer merely fleeing the plantation, but moving toward a diplomatic crossroads that would determine his fate. He realized that the warrior's survival was his only currency, a bargaining chip that might purchase safe passage or result in his execution, depending on the temperament of those who approached. Preparing for the encounter required a strategic alteration of their current position. The limestone ravine, while providing water and concealment, was a death trap if surrounded, a geographical cul-de-sac that offered no avenue of escape. Silas fashioned a more robust support for Walking Crow, utilizing sturdy branches and strips of rawhide cut from the warrior's own leggings to create a crutch that could bear his weight. The process was agonizing for the injured man, his jaw clenched against the pain as Silas worked, but the promise of rescue fortified his resolve. Historical accounts of frontier medicine often highlight the efficacy of these improvised devices, born of necessity in a land where formal surgical equipment was non-existent. Silas helped the warrior to his feet, supporting the majority of his weight as they began the slow, arduous climb out of the canyon, leaving the sanctuary of the stream for the exposure of the open plains. The ascent took the better part of the morning, a grueling testament to the endurance of both men. Under the glare of the midday sun, they emerged onto the flat expanse above, the heat radiating off the limestone in shimmering waves. Silas scanned the terrain, his eyes squinting against the glare, searching for the movement of riders that the smoke had promised. The silence of the plains was oppressive, broken only by the ceaseless wind that whispered through the dry grass, a sound that masked the approach of friend and foe alike. He felt the weight of the turquoise totem in his pocket, a physical reminder of the bond that had been forged in blood and iron, a bond that was about to be tested against the rigid structures of tribal loyalty and racial prejudice. Without warning, the horizon seemed to come alive as a group of riders crested a distant ridge, their silhouettes cutting sharp figures against the sky. There were 6 of them, moving with a synchronized grace that spoke of lifetimes spent in the saddle, their horses painting a fluid picture against the stark backdrop. Silas's heart seized in his chest, a mixture of hope and terror flooding his veins. He stood his ground, holding Walking Crow upright, refusing to drop the warrior or reach for his meager weapon. To run was to admit guilt or fear. To stand was to assert his status as an ally, a distinction that could mean the difference between life and death in the coming seconds. As the riders approached at a gallop, the thunder of hooves vibrating through the soles of Silas's boots, he could see the distinct markings on their horses and the paint on their faces, signs of a war party. They circled the two men, a whirlwind of dust and motion, lances lowered in a display of dominance that was intended to intimidate. Silas remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the leader, a man with a scarred chest and feathers woven into his hair. The tension was palpable, a physical force that pressed against Silas's chest, choking the air from his lungs. The language barrier, which had been a mere inconvenience in the quiet of the canyon, now loomed as a potentially fatal obstacle, a wall of silence that could easily be misinterpreted as hostility. Walking Crow suddenly straightened, pushing away from Silas's support to stand, however shakily, on his own good leg. He raised a hand in a gesture of authority, shouting a command in the Kiowa tongue that cut through the dust and noise. The circling riders immediately pulled back on their reins, their horses skidding to a halt in a display of horsemanship that bordered on the supernatural. The warrior began to speak, his voice rough but commanding, gesturing first to his injured leg and then to Silas. He pointed to the turquoise around Silas's neck, recounting the events of the trap and the mercy shown by the fugitive. The leader of the scouting party, a man Silas would later know as 10 Bears, dismounted and approached with a cautious, predatory grace. 10 Bears examined Walking Crow's wound with a clinical eye, noting the crude bandages and the alignment of the splint. He then turned his attention to Silas, his gaze sweeping over the tattered plantation clothes and the dark skin that marked him as a fugitive. The scrutiny was intense, a silent interrogation that stripped away Silas's defenses. 10 Bears reached out and touched the turquoise pendant, tracing the silver setting with a calloused finger before looking into Silas's eyes. There was no hatred in that look, but a cold, calculating assessment of value. Silas stood silent, allowing the examination to proceed, understanding that his life now hung in the balance of a ledger he could not read. After a long, agonizing moment, 10 Bears nodded and spoke a single word, gesturing for Silas to mount one of the spare horses being led by the party. The transition from the ground to the saddle was a relief that nearly buckled Silas's knees, the muscular animal beneath him a stark contrast to the weary exhaustion of his own legs. Walking Crow was lifted onto a horse behind one of the other warriors, his grip firm on the mane, despite his pain. The formation turned as one unit, moving southward toward the signal smoke that still rose in the distance. Silas was now a part of a procession, no longer a lone fugitive, but a component of a larger, more complex social structure that he was only beginning to comprehend. The ride to the Kiowa encampment took several hours, crossing a landscape that shifted from rugged limestone breaks to rolling prairie. As they traveled, Silas observed the interactions of the warriors, noting the deference paid to Walking Crow despite his injury, confirming his status within the band. The silence between them was not one of hostility, but of observation. Silas was being watched, his every reaction catalogued and judged. The pseudo-documentary record of this period often notes the presence of African Americans within native tribes, yet the specifics of their integration varied wildly. Silas was entering a world where his black skin did not automatically relegate him to the status of property, but his status remained undefined, hovering between guest and captive. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the grass, the outlines of the camp appeared in a shallow valley protected by a bend in the river. The circle of lodges was a symphony of organization, each position within the circle denoting status and responsibility. The arrival of the scouting party drew immediate attention, women and children emerging from the tents to greet the returning warriors. The mood was a mix of relief for Walking Crow's return and curiosity regarding the stranger who rode among them. Silas felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, a scrutiny that was far more intense than that of the riders, for this was the community that would decide his ultimate fate. They dismounted in the center of the circle, near the large lodge of the chief, a structure distinguished by its size and the paintings on its hide walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the distinct, earthy smell of the buffalo robes that covered the lodges. Silas stood beside his horse, uncertain of the protocol, waiting for a signal that would indicate his next move. The physical journey was over, but the trial of his acceptance was just beginning. He touched the turquoise at his chest, drawing strength from the connection it represented, ready to face the council that would determine whether his act of mercy had purchased his freedom or merely delayed his capture. The arrangement of the lodges within the valley followed a celestial logic, positioning the central council tent toward the rising sun, a spatial hierarchy that predicated social order. Silas stood in the center of this living citadel, the weight of the community's gaze pressing upon him like a physical burden. Chief Iron Horse emerged from the largest lodge, his bearing erect, and his face a weathered map of authority, flanked by men whose posture suggested both martial prowess and civic responsibility. The initial silence was profound, a deliberate vacuum intended to unsettle the stranger and establish the power dynamic before a single word was spoken. Silas, drawing upon the composure required of him on the auction block, met the chief's gaze with a steady resolve, understanding that his survival now depended on navigating the intricate protocols of a foreign sovereignty. Walking Crow, though pale from loss of blood, insisted on standing to address the assembly, his arm draped over the shoulder of a younger warrior for support. He recounted the narrative of the iron trap and the intervention of the black stranger, his voice gaining strength as he detailed the medical care Silas had provided. The rhetorical structure of his testimony mirrored the oral traditions of the plains, emphasizing the specific debts of life and the spiritual consequences of abandonment. The crowd listened with a stillness that honored the gravity of the account, their eyes shifting periodically to Silas to measure his reaction to the words he could not understand. The presentation of the turquoise talisman served as the final piece of evidence, a physical object that transcended language to prove the veracity of the claimed brotherhood. Iron Horse examined the talisman with a detached reverence, his fingers tracing the craftsmanship before returning his attention to Silas. He posed a question through 10 bears who possessed a rudimentary grasp of English, acquired through trade with southern outposts. The chief inquired why a man running from the long knives would pause to save a native warrior, a choice that defied the logic of self-preservation. Silas responded with a measured simplicity, explaining that he knew the taste of iron and the reality of being hunted, and that he could not walk past a man caught in the same machinery of suffering. This admission of shared persecution resonated with the council, creating a philosophical bridge between the fugitive slave and the displaced native, two populations facing the relentless expansion of the Republic of Texas. The council withdrew into a hushed conference, their voices low and rhythmic, debating the implications of harboring a fugitive. Silas remained in the center of the circle, acutely aware of his isolation. He was neither a guest nor a prisoner, suspended in a state of existential limbo. The possibility of being turned over to the authorities or executed to avoid conflict with the white settlers was a tangible threat, a calculation of political expediency that often decided the fate of the marginalized. During this interminable wait, a woman approached with a bowl of pemmican and a cup of water, placing them at his feet without making eye contact. This small gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition of his basic humanity, provided a fragile reassurance that the decision of the council might lean toward mercy rather than pragmatism. When the elders emerged, Iron Horse announced the verdict with a solemn finality that brooked no dispute. Silas was granted the status of a temporary ward, a classification that offered protection under the chief's personal aegis, but stopped short of full tribal adoption. The chief's decision was a strategic maneuver, an act of resistance against the encroaching laws of the Republic that sought to dictate who could reside on the plains. Silas was assigned a space near Walking Crow's family lodge, a proximity that symbolized their linked destinies. The transition from a solitary fugitive to a protected member of the community, however tenuous, marked a profound shift in Silas's understanding of his own agency within the larger struggle for freedom. Over the subsequent weeks, Silas integrated into the daily rhythms of the camp, utilizing the healing knowledge he had acquired on the plantation to tend to Walking Crow's festering wound. The warrior's recovery was slow, hampered by the onset of infection that required the application of poultices made from boiled yarrow and chewing herbs. Through these sessions of medical care, a deeper linguistic exchange began to take root. Walking Crow instructed Silas in the Kiowa tongue, pointing to objects and actions with a patience that belied his reputation as a fierce combatant. In return, Silas taught the warrior the English words necessary for survival in the borderlands, creating a hybrid lexicon that belonged solely to their shared experience, a private language forged in the aftermath of violence. The internal politics of the camp, however, were not entirely aligned in Silas's favor. A faction of younger warriors, led by a brave named Little Mountain, viewed the black stranger with suspicion, seeing him as a magnet for the blue-coated soldiers who periodically scouted the territory. Little Mountain's opposition was not rooted in racial animosity, but in a pragmatic assessment of risk. The presence of an escaped slave was a provocation to the white settlements, a potential justification for military reprisal. This undercurrent of hostility manifested in subtle challenges, a jostle in the common path, the theft of Silas's food ration, that tested his resolve and forced him to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the band without the protection of Walking Crow by his side. The tension within the camp reached a breaking point on a humid afternoon when Little Mountain intercepted Silas near the river, blocking his path with a display of aggressive posturing. The warrior brandished a knife, his intentions masked by a rhetorical question about Silas's right to draw water from the Kiowa's source. Before the confrontation could escalate into physical violence, 10 bears intervened, stepping between them with an air of casual authority that diffused the immediate threat. The scolding 10 bears delivered to Little Mountain was public and humiliating, a reaffirmation of the chief's decree that Silas was under the tribe's protection. This incident served as a crucible, hardening Silas's resolve and earning him a measure of wary respect from those who had previously viewed him as a liability. As the moon cycled through its phases, the reality of Silas's situation became increasingly precarious. Scouting parties returning from the eastern borders reported an increase in the activity of the horse thieves, a euphemism for the militias and ranger companies that policed the region for escaped chattel. The description of one particular party, led by a tall man with a scarred face who carried a heavy iron whip, sent a chill through the camp. Walking Crow, whose mobility was improving daily, confirmed Silas's fear. Cornelius Thorne had not abandoned the hunt. The plantation owner's pursuit was driven by a lethal combination of financial investment and a pathological need to assert dominance over his property, transforming the search into a personal crusade that threatened the safety of the entire band. Iron Horse convened a secondary council to address the intelligence brought by the scouts, acknowledging that the sanctuary they had offered Silas was now under direct siege. The chief, while unwilling to rescind his protection, made it clear that the camp could not remain stationary indefinitely if it risked drawing the full force of the Texas Rangers upon them. The strategic necessity of movement clashed with the logistical difficulty of transporting a recovering warrior and a fugitive across open country. The deliberations were fraught with tension, weighing the sacred obligation of hospitality against the survival of the collective, a dilemma that often plagued indigenous communities caught in the crossfire of colonization. The solution emerged through Walking Crow, who proposed a split in the party to divide the risk. He offered to escort Silas northeast toward the Colorado River, where rumors suggested a network of safe houses operated by sympathetic white men and free people of color. A smaller, faster group could evade detection more easily than the encumbered main camp, drawing Thorne's pursuit away from the vulnerable women and children. The proposal was a tactical masterstroke, satisfying Little Mountain's concerns about the camp's safety, while honoring the debt of life Walking Crow owed to Silas. Iron Horse assented to the plan, allocating a handful of trusted warriors to the mission and providing supplies for the arduous journey ahead, cementing a strategic alliance that extended beyond mere charity. As the sun rose on the morning of their departure, Silas stood once again on the periphery of the camp, preparing to trade the relative security of the Kiowa Lodge for the uncertainty of the trail. He looked at Walking Crow, who limped toward his horse with a grim determination that mirrored Silas's own, their fates now inextricably linked by the iron jaws of the trap and the turquoise of brotherhood. The departure was quiet, devoid of the fanfare accorded to war parties, a somber acknowledgment of the danger that lay ahead. They rode out in single file, the turquoise around Silas's neck catching the light, a beacon of the improbable bond that had defied the laws of the Republic and the prejudices of the frontier. The topography of the frontier shifted subtly as the small band of riders moved northeast, the limestone escarpments giving way to rolling prairies broken by dense mottes of oak and pecan. The pace was grueling, a calculated risk prioritizing speed over stealth to outdistance the news of their departure that might reach the ears of the militia. For 5 days, the group rode hard, the silence between them filled only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the ever-present wind that sculpted the grasslands. Historical weather records from the autumn of 1847 indicate a season of erratic storms, and the riders faced sudden squalls that turned the trails into quagmires, testing the endurance of the horses and the healing leg of Walking Crow. Silas, unaccustomed to the saddle for such prolonged periods, found his body screaming in protest, yet he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that the alternative was a return to the brutal calculus of chattel slavery. During the nights, huddled around small, smokeless fires, the dynamic between Silas and the Kiowa warriors began to evolve from mere coexistence to a tentative camaraderie. 10 Bears, the war leader who had initially viewed Silas with suspicion, revealed a dry, cynical humor through a series of pantomimed jokes about the ineptitude of the white soldiers they had evaded. These moments of levity were crucial in bridging the cultural chasm, humanizing the other in a way that high-minded speeches could not. Silas learned to read the subtle signs of the plains, the flight patterns of birds indicating water, the specific curl of smoke suggesting distant settlements. And in return, he shared the intricate codes of the slave quarters, the silent language of resistance that had kept his people alive for generations. This exchange of knowledge forged a bond of mutual respect, a recognition that they were both veterans of a war for survival against a common encroaching enemy. By the 6th day, the landscape began to show the scars of civilization, with fence lines appearing like jagged wounds across the open range, marking the encroachment of the cotton economy. They were approaching the fringes of the settled districts, a region where the law of the Republic of Texas held sway, and the presence of a war party would be met with immediate hostility. Walking Crow called a halt in a dense copse of trees near a creek bank, pointing to a faint trail of dust rising to the south. It was a patrol, likely rangers or a militia unit, moving perpendicular to their path. The proximity of this threat forced the group to alter their route, striking north toward a region dotted with small homesteads, known to be sympathetic to those fleeing the plantation system, a network of descent that operated in the shadows of the slave economy. The intelligence provided by the Kiowa scouts indicated they were nearing the homestead of a man named Harlan, a reclusive farmer whose wife, a Cherokee exile, had instilled in him a deep hatred for the institution of slavery. Harlan's farm was a known waypoint, a place where the pursuit of profit yielded to the higher law of conscience, a rarity in a territory where the bounty for a fugitive could amount to $600 or more. As they approached the perimeter of the farm, however, the atmosphere grew tense. The usual signs of a working homestead were absent, replaced by an ominous stillness. The barn doors stood open, and the yard was empty of livestock, a tableau of abandonment that triggered a visceral alarm in Silas's gut. The sanctuary they had been counting on appeared to have been compromised, transforming a hopeful destination into a potential kill zone. Silas dismounted and moved forward on foot, using the cover of a stone wall to survey the house, his senses straining against the silence. Through a gap in the stones, he saw the glint of a rifle barrel in the loft window of the main house, not positioned for defense against intruders, but aimed downward, covering the yard. It was an ambush, a trap set not by the owner, but by those waiting for desperate travelers. Silas signaled to Walking Crow and 10 Bears, indicating the danger with a series of sharp, urgent hand gestures. The realization that they had walked into the orbit of Thorn's extensive network of informants and bounty hunters hit with the force of a physical blow. The hunter had anticipated the prey's need for shelter, turning the sanctuary into a cage. Before they could withdraw and fade back into the brush, the back door of the farmhouse burst open, and 3 men emerged, dragging a 4th figure between them. It was Harlan, the farmer, his face blooded and his hands bound tightly behind his back, stumbling as he was shoved toward a large oak tree in the yard. Following them, 2 more men escorted a black woman and a young child, their wrists shackled, their faces masks of terror. The sight struck a chord deep within Silas, a memory of the auction block and the cruel separation of families that had defined his youth. The slave catchers, a rough-looking group equipped with heavy coats and broad-brimmed hats, were not merely waiting. They were actively processing their catch, preparing to transport the fugitives back to the counties where the reward money awaited them. A fierce debate erupted among the Kiowa warriors in hushed whispers. 10 Bears argued for retreat, pointing out that they were outnumbered and that a confrontation would draw the full weight of the Republic's military apparatus down upon their people. Walking Crow, however, gripped his lance and looked at Silas, his eyes reflecting the same moral imperative that had driven Silas to open the trap. The debt of life, he argued through gesture and expression, was not limited to the individual. It extended to the defense of the helpless against the predator. Silas made the decision for them, checking his pistol and nodding toward the yard. He could not walk away from this, not when the iron of the shackles was so clearly visible. The plan was hastily formed, a coordinated strike designed to exploit the element of surprise before the catchers could organize a defense. The engagement began with a terrifying suddenness, 10 Bears and his warriors unleashing a war whoop that shattered the quiet of the afternoon, riding their horses directly into the perimeter of the yard. The initial volley of arrows and rifle fire sowed chaos among the catchers, who scrambled for cover behind the farmhouse well and a wood pile, abandoning their prisoners in the confusion. Silas, moving on foot, flanked the chaos, using the distraction to sprint toward the oak tree where Harlan was being held. A bullet kicked up dirt near his heel, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing off the farmhouse walls, but he did not falter. He reached the farmer and began sawing at the ropes with his knife, the rough hemp parting quickly under the serrated edge. Harlan, despite his injuries, immediately moved to assist, shouting warnings about the catchers' positions. The battle was a chaotic melee of gun smoke and screaming horses, a violent collision of 2 worlds on the compacted dirt of the farmyard. Silas engaged one of the catchers in a hand-to-hand struggle near the barn, the man's weight bearing down on him as they fought for control of a rifle. The visceral reality of the conflict, the smell of sweat and powder, the grunts of exertion, stripped away the abstract notion of freedom, leaving only the primal struggle for life. Silas managed to gain the upper hand, driving the man back with a blow to the throat before retrieving his own weapon. Meanwhile, the Kiowa warriors displayed their formidable equestrian skills, sweeping in to cut the shackles off the woman and child, effectively rescuing the prisoners, in a whirlwind of motion that left the catchers bewildered and outmaneuvered. As quickly as it had begun, the fight concluded, the remaining catchers either incapacitated or fleeing into the surrounding woods on foot, their horses scattered by the Kiowa. The yard fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the victors. Silas stood amidst the aftermath, the smoking pistol in his hand, looking at the faces of the people he had helped liberate. The woman clutched her child, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, while Harlan leaned against the oak tree, clutching his ribs. Walking Crow limped over to Silas, his face streaked with dust and blood, and placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it took to engage in a fight that was not strictly his own. The necessity of immediate flight overrode the impulse to tend to the aftermath or search the farm for supplies. They could not linger, for the gunfire would surely attract attention from neighboring homesteads or bring the rangers down upon them within the hour. Harlan, despite his injuries, directed them toward a hidden cache of supplies in his root cellar and provided final instructions for the next leg of the journey. With the two new fugitives placed on spare horses, the expanded group turned their backs on the smoking farm and rode into the gathering dusk, their silhouette merging with the dark line of the horizon. They were no longer just a band of runaways and warriors. They were a moving insurrection, a testament to the power of alliance in a land built on division. The adrenaline of the firefight at Harlan's farm evaporated into a cold, crystalline fear as the group pushed northwest, seeking to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the scene of the violence. The two new fugitives, a woman named Esther and her son, rode mounted behind Silas and Walking Crow, their silence speaking volumes about the trauma they had just endured. The topography began to shift once more, the rolling prairies giving way to the dense, tangled woodlands of the cross timbers, a natural barrier that separated the settled east from the plains of the west. Historical journals from the period often describe this region as a forest of giants, where ancient oaks grew so thick that a horseman could barely pass between them. For the exhausted party, this impenetrable wall of timber offered a double-edged sword, excellent concealment from the pursuing militias, but treacherous footing that slowed their progress to a crawl. As they navigated the labyrinth of the cross timbers, the physical toll of the journey began to manifest in Walking Crow's deteriorating condition. The warrior, who had ridden with stoic determination since leaving the Kiowa camp, now showed signs of a feverish relapse, his face flushed and his grip on the saddle horn white-knuckled with pain. The exertion of the battle and the hard ride had strained his healing leg, reopening the internal wounds that Silas had worked so hard to mend. They were forced to make an unscheduled halt in a dense thicket, camouflaging themselves among the scrub oaks, while Silas examined the injury. The leg was swollen and hot to the touch, a silent testament to the fragility of their endeavor. Without the warrior's guidance and protection, their chances of navigating the intricate routes to freedom would diminish drastically, leaving them vulnerable in a landscape that offered no mercy to the lost. During the forced rest, the group's dynamic began to coalesce into a singular unit of purpose. Esther, despite her own ordeal, revealed a quiet resilience, taking over the task of gathering firewood and preparing a meager broth from the dried meat in their packs. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime managing scarcity, her hands working deftly to create comfort from nothing. Silas observed her interactions with the Kiowa warriors, noting how she offered them water with a respectful nod that transcended language barriers. This small temporary camp in the heart of the woods became a crucible for a new kind of family, one forged not by blood or ownership, but by shared adversity and the collective will to survive. It was a tangible refutation of the dehumanizing logic of the plantation, where enforced isolation was the primary tool of control. The respite was short-lived, shattered by the distant but unmistakable sound of a bugle call echoing through the trees to the east. It was a military signal, crisp and authoritative, cutting through the humid air like a knife. Silas froze, the sound triggering a visceral memory of the overseer's horn that dictated the rhythm of life and labor on the Thornwood plantation. The reality of their situation shifted instantly. They were no longer being pursued by a ragtag group of bounty hunters, but were now the quarry of a coordinated military effort. The Republic of Texas, in its final years before annexation, was increasingly utilizing its militia forces to secure the borders and protect the property rights of its citizens. This escalation meant that the net was tightening, drawn by the threads of Silas's initial act of defiance. Scouts dispatched by 10 Bears returned with grim expressions, reporting the presence of a large column of riders moving along the trail they had just vacated. Among them, they identified a distinct figure riding a white stallion at the rear of the column, a man whose posture radiated a cold, aristocratic authority. Cornelius Thorne had joined the hunt. The plantation owner's presence transformed the pursuit from a legal matter of recapture into a personal crusade, a collision course that Silas had dreaded since the night of his escape. Thorne was not merely seeking the return of his property. He was intent on proving the absolute dominion of the master over the enslaved, an ideological imperative that justified any expense or violence. The revelation of Thorne's proximity forced a strategic reassessment of their route. Walking Crow, despite his fever, insisted that the original plan to head toward the established underground railroad stations to the north was now compromised. The militia would be watching those routes, expecting the fugitives to follow the well-worn paths to freedom. Instead, he proposed a bolder, more dangerous path. They would swing south, skirting the edge of the Comanche area, using the buffer zone between the white settlements and the hostile plains to lose their pursuers. It was a counterintuitive maneuver, moving closer to the danger of the warring tribes to escape the danger of the law, but it was the only option that offered a statistical chance of evasion. The decision to move south brought with it a new set of logistical nightmares. The terrain became rougher, a broken landscape of ravines and dry creek beds that tested the endurance of the horses and the resolve of the riders. Silas rode point, his eyes scanning the horizon for the dust clouds that would signal an approaching patrol, while 10 Bears brought up the rear, obscuring their tracks with branches. The psychological pressure was immense. Every shadow in the moonlight seemed to take the shape of a ranger. Every rustle in the grass sounded like the cocking of a rifle. The fugitives were running on the ragged edge of exhaustion, sustained only by the adrenaline of the chase and the terrifying knowledge of what awaited them if they faltered. On the third day of this grueling detour, they stumbled upon the ruins of an old Spanish mission, a decaying skeleton of stone and adobe that stood as a monument to a previous era of colonial ambition. The structure, abandoned decades prior during the revolutions that birthed Mexico, offered a temporary shelter from the beating sun and a defensible position for the night. As they settled into the crumbling cloisters, the atmosphere was heavy with the ghosts of the past, a reminder that the struggle for dominion over this land was a recurring cycle. Silas touched the weathered stones, feeling a strange kinship with the monks who had once walked these halls, driven by a faith that they believed would endure, only to see their world crumble into dust. It was here, within the shadowed walls of the mission, that Silas finally confronted the reality of his own mortality. He spoke with Walking Crow in the quiet hours of the night, their communication now a fluid mix of Kiowa and English. The warrior admitted that his leg might never fully heal enough for him to ride as he once did, a confession that carried the weight of a diminished future. Silas, in turn, shared the memories of his family, his wife and children, sold away to the cotton lands of the deep South, a loss that had hollowed him out long before he ever stepped into the iron trap. This exchange of vulnerability cemented their bond, transforming their alliance from a pact of convenience into a brotherhood of shared grief and defiant hope. The following morning brought a new, urgent development. A lone rider approached the mission under a white flag, a stark contrast to the warlike posture of the previous days. It was a courier, a mixed-blood man known in the territory as a go-between for the various factions. He carried a message from Cornelius Thorne, a document sealed with wax that contained a chilling proposition. Thorne offered a pardon for the white savages and the Indians who had aided the fugitive, provided they surrendered Silas immediately. The bounty on Silas's head had been raised to $1,000, a staggering sum that equated to a small fortune in the cash-poor frontier economy, enough to tempt even the most loyal of allies. The courier's offer was met with a stony silence by the group. 10 bears spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt that required no translation, while Esther clutched her son closer, her eyes darting to Silas with a mixture of fear and solidarity. The offer was a strategic wedge, an attempt to fracture the alliance by appealing to the base instinct of greed and self-preservation. Yet, in that moment of testing, the bond held firm. Silas looked at the faces around him, warriors, a mother, a child, and realized that Thorne's world, where every man had his price and every relationship was a transaction, held no sway here. They were no longer individuals acting out of self-interest. They were a collective, and the refusal of the offer was a declaration of independence far more potent than any written document. With the rejection of Thorne's offer, the conflict entered its final, desperate phase. The courier rode away, taking with him the last illusion of a peaceful resolution. Silas knew that the full force of Thorne's wrath would now be unleashed, and their only hope lay in reaching the sanctuary of Indian territory before the net closed completely. The group mounted their horses, leaving the crumbling safety of the mission behind, and turned their faces toward the north, toward the Red River, and the promise of a land where the laws of the Republic held no sway. The chase was no longer just about escaping. It was about proving that a man could not be owned, and that the chains of iron and law were ultimately no match for the unbreakable links of brotherhood. The grueling detour through the cross timbers and the brush with thorns militia had cost them precious days, forcing the group to abandon their planned route toward the Red River crossings. With their supplies dwindling and the horses showing signs of fatigue, 10 Bears advocated for a desperate change in course, pointing the group toward a remote settlement on the edge of the frontier, a place known only through the whispers of the trade networks. This settlement, they hoped, might offer a brief respite and fresh mounts, a necessary gamble in a game where the stakes were life and liberty. The ride was tense, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves on the packed earth, as Silas constantly scanned the horizon for the dust clouds that would signal the resumption of the chase. They arrived at the settlement under the cover of a thick, pre-dawn fog, a small cluster of cabins that seemed to materialize from the mist like a mirage. It was a borderland community, a liminal space where the laws of the Republic of Texas held only a tenuous grip, inhabited by a mix of displaced natives, squatters, and those seeking to vanish into the vastness of the West. The settlement was quiet, the only movement coming from a few stray dogs that barked half-heartedly at the approaching strangers. Silas felt the familiar tension of entering an unknown social environment, the need to assess friend from foe, masking his exhaustion as they dismounted in the center of the muddy street. As the sun began to burn off the fog, the group was approached by a Quaker man named Josiah, his plain dress and wide-brimmed hat marking him as an outsider in this rough-hewn locale. Josiah, a conductor for the Underground Railroad operating far beyond its usual geographic bounds, recognized the composition of the group, black fugitives escorted by native warriors, as a specific signal of distress. He ushered them quickly into a barn behind his modest cabin, speaking in low, hurried tones about the increased presence of slave catchers in the area, men who were becoming bolder in their extrajudicial raids. The barn, hidden from the main road by a thicket of overgrown brush, offered a temporary sanctuary that felt incredibly fragile against the vast, open hostility of the region. Inside the dim interior of the barn, the tension finally broke, allowing the reality of their situation to settle in. Esther wept silently as she settled her son onto a bed of straw, the adrenaline of the flight wearing off to reveal the depth of her trauma. Walking Crow, his leg now visibly swollen and hot to the touch, leaned against a support beam, his face a mask of stoic pain that could no longer be fully concealed. Silas paced the small space, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had led them here, and the refusal of Thorn's offer had turned them into marked targets. The sanctuary provided by Josiah was a momentary pause, a breath taken before the plunge, but it did little to alleviate the crushing pressure of the inevitable pursuit. Josiah returned with a bowl of cornmeal mush and a map spread out on a wooden crate, his demeanor calm but urgent. He pointed to the northern routes, the traditional paths to the free states of Kansas and Missouri, shaking his head grimly as he traced the lines with a calloused finger. Intelligence from other stations indicated that Thorn had successfully lobbied the local militias to blockade the northern passes, effectively sealing the corridor that Silas had hoped to use. The financial incentive for the capture of the group had reportedly risen to $2,000, a bounty that had attracted a small army of mercenaries and opportunists to the region, making the northern route a perilous march. The revelation that the north was closed forced a radical strategic pivot. Josiah suggested an alternative path, one that was rarely used due to the treacherous terrain and the political instability of the destination. He proposed heading east, crossing the Red River into the independent lands of the Indian Territory, a region that existed outside the direct jurisdiction of the United States and the Republic of Texas. It was a daunting prospect, requiring them to traverse a war zone where the Creek and Seminole nations were themselves resisting removal and assimilation. Yet, it offered the only statistical probability of evasion, a chance to disappear into a society that had its own complex relationship with the concept of freedom. The group debated the new plan in hushed tones, weighing the known dangers of the chase against the unknown perils of the territory ahead. 10 Bears expressed skepticism about entering the lands of rival tribes without a formal escort, while Walking Crow argued that the Creek had a history of alliance with the displaced, offering a potential diplomatic opening. Silas listened to the arguments, his mind racing with the implications of the choice. To go north was to walk into a trap. To go east was to walk into the unknown. He looked at Esther and her son, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, and realized that the decision was not merely about survival, but about the possibility of a future where they were not running. A sudden commotion outside the barn froze the debate, the sharp sound of hooves and men's voices cutting through the night air. Josiah moved to a crack in the barn boards, peering out with a tense expression before turning back to the group with a warning. A patrol of militia was riding through the settlement, stopping at every house to search for stolen property and questioning the inhabitants about the presence of strangers. The barn was not secure. A thorough search would reveal them within minutes, and the presence of the Kiowa warriors would undoubtedly spark a violent confrontation. The realization that their sanctuary had been compromised propelled the group into immediate action. They gathered their meager belongings, helping Esther and her son to their feet, while the warriors silently readied their weapons. Josiah led them to a hidden trapdoor in the floor of the barn, revealing a root cellar that connected to a drainage culvert leading out to the forest edge. It was a tight, claustrophobic escape route, but it offered the only chance to slip away before the patrol reached them. Silas helped lower Esther into the darkness, the damp smell of earth and rot filling his nostrils as he prepared to follow. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, the sound of the militia's voices grew louder, muffled by the earth but distinct enough to understand. They were looking for a black man and a group of Indians, a description that fit the party perfectly. The fear of discovery was a physical weight, pressing down on Silas's back as he moved through the mud, the darkness of the tunnel offering a grim reflection of the precariousness of their existence. They emerged from the culvert into the dense undergrowth of the forest, the cool night air hitting their faces like a reprieve, though the danger was far from over. They regrouped in the shadows of the tree line, watching as the militia moved toward Josiah's cabin with torches held high. The Quaker stood in his doorway, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, engaging the soldiers in a loud, theological argument about the sin of ownership. His sacrifice provided the necessary distraction for the group to slip away into the night, leaving the settlement behind. They turned their horses toward the east, the Red River calling them toward a new chapter of their journey, a flight into the heart of the continent's tribal sovereignty. The blockade to the north had forced their hand, but as Silas nudged his horse into a gallop, he felt a grim sense of determination solidifying in his chest. They would find freedom, or they would die seeking it, but they would not be taken. The decision to strike eastward toward the Red River plunged the group into a landscape that felt less like geography and more like a purgatory of mud and shadow. They moved under the cover of darkness, navigating by the stars that pierced the canopy of the cross-timber forests, the terrain growing increasingly treacherous as they neared the great boundary line. Silas rode with a tension that knotted his shoulders, the weight of the militia's close call at the Quaker settlement pressing him forward. This was the edge of the known world for most Texans. Beyond lay the Indian Territory, a strip of earth contested by the federal government, the native nations, and the forces of entropy. The map in Josiah's barn had been their last reliable guide, and now they relied on the instincts of Walking Crow and the sharp eyes of 10 Bears to navigate a region that was actively being redrawn by treaty and blood. The rain began on the second day, a relentless grey curtain that turned the trails into sloughs of muck and reduced visibility to mere yards. The physical misery was profound, seeping into their bones and chafing their skin, yet it offered a strategic advantage. The downpour would obliterate their tracks, washing away the evidence of their passage. Historical meteorological records from the autumn of 1847 confirm a season of unusual precipitation, a factor that historians often cite as a critical element in the success of numerous fugitive flights during this turbulent period. Silas wrapped his jacket tighter around Esther's son, the boy shivering despite the humidity, and pushed the horse onward, the animal's hooves squelching in the sodden earth. As they neared the Red River, the terrain shifted dramatically, the dense timber opening up into vast, flooded bottomlands that stretched towards the horizon like a chocolate-colored sea. The river itself was a formidable barrier, swollen by the rains into a churning torrent that rolled massive logs and debris downstream with a violent indifference. The group halted on a bluff overlooking the water, the sheer scale of the obstacle inducing a moment of despair. There were no bridges here, no ferries to carry a mixed party of fugitives and warriors. The river was a living entity, and it barred their passage with a liquid wall that seemed to dare them to attempt a crossing. Walking Crow dismounted and examined the banks, his face etched with concern. He explained through a mix of hand signals and broken English that the river's usual fords were completely submerged, meaning they would have to swim the horses across. The risk was immense. The current was strong enough to sweep a horse off its feet, and a single misstep could drag a rider under the tangled roots and submerged debris. Yet, the patrol to their rear was a tangible threat, a pressure that left no room for hesitation. They identified a stretch where the current seemed to slow, a wide bend that offered a marginally better chance of survival, and prepared for the plunge. Silas helped Esther and her son down from the horses, securing the boy to 10 Bears' back with strips of cloth, ensuring that the warrior's strong arms would be the child's lifeline. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and the roar of the river, a sensory overload that made speech difficult. Silas felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach, a primal reaction to the prospect of being swallowed by the dark water, but he swallowed it down. He looked at the determined faces of his companions, refugees, warriors, a mother protecting her child, and found the resolve to move forward. The crossing would be the final severance from the territory of their bondage. Once they reached the far bank, they would be in a new world. They entered the water in a tight line, the horses snorting and plunging as the cold hit their chests. The initial steps were manageable, the riverbed firm, but as they moved deeper, the current caught them with a violent force that threatened to tear the group apart. Silas gripped the mane of his horse, his legs locked around its barrel, fighting to keep the animal's head pointed upstream to minimize the drag. The water rose to his armpits, then to his neck, a cold embrace that stole the breath from his lungs. For a terrifying moment, the horse lost its footing, swirling in the powerful eddy, and Silas felt the world invert, the sky and water swapping places in a chaotic spin. He kicked hard, fighting the weight of his soaked clothing and the pull of the current, his hand brushing against the rough bark of a submerged log. With a grunt of exertion, he hauled himself back toward the surface, breaking through into the rainy air with a gasp. He found the reins again, the horse thrashing beside him, and urged it forward with desperate strength. The far bank was a dark smear in the rain, a distant promise of solid ground that seemed to recede even as they fought toward it. Beside him, he heard Esther cry out as her horse stumbled, but 10 Bears was there in an instant, grabbing the animal's bridle and hauling it back into the lane. The struggle seemed to last an eternity, a timeless loop of cold, force, and fear, until finally Silas felt the horse's hooves strike solid ground. They emerged from the river, like creatures birthed from the earth, gasping and shivering, the water streaming from their bodies. The bank was steep and muddy, requiring them to claw their way up through the clinging clay. But they were across. They collapsed on the wet grass of the Indian Territory, the roar of the river fading behind them, replaced by the heavy silence of the forest. They had survived the crossing, but the ordeal had drained the last reserves of their strength, leaving them exposed and vulnerable on the edge of a new and uncertain sovereignty. The immediate need was warmth and shelter, for the chill of the rain and river threatened hypothermia. They moved inland, seeking the shelter of the dense post oak groves that fringed the river bottom. Walking Crow, despite his own exhaustion and the pain in his leg, took the lead, searching for a spot that was defensible and dry. They found a hollow beneath a massive fallen oak, its root system creating a natural roof that offered some protection from the elements. The group huddled together, sharing body heat while Silas struggled to strike a spark from his flint to the damp tinder, a task that seemed impossible until a small curl of smoke finally rose, promising fire. As the flames caught, casting a flickering light against the dark trunks of the trees, the reality of their location settled over them. They were no longer in the Republic of Texas. They had crossed into the domain of the 5 civilized tribes, a complex patchwork of nations forced west by the Indian Removal Act. This land was a sovereign entity in theory, but in practice it was a pressure cooker of factionalism and federal interference. Silas knew that their presence here was precarious. While some tribes had integrated former slaves as equals, others had adopted the plantation economy of the South, owning slaves themselves. The line between sanctuary and a different kind of captivity was blurred, a dangerous ambiguity that required them to proceed with extreme caution. The night passed in a blur of half-sleep and fitful waking, every rustle in the underbrush interpreted as a threat. When dawn broke, grey and damp, the group rose, stiff and sore, but alive. They gathered their meager supplies and prepared to move deeper into the territory, toward the creek settlement that Josiah had indicated. The journey was no longer just about physical endurance. It was now a diplomatic mission, requiring them to navigate the intricate social hierarchies of a displaced people. Silas looked at the turquoise totem around his neck, a gift from a Kiowa warrior, and hoped that it would speak for them in a land where they had no voice, a symbol of the brotherhood that had brought them this far. They traveled for 3 days through the territory, moving cautiously to avoid the established roads and settlements. The landscape was a mix of prairie and timber, rich with game, but lacking the familiar landmarks of the southern plains. Signs of habitation began to appear: a fence line, a well-worn path, the distant sound of a dog barking. The tension in the group ratcheted up with every step. They were approaching the creek town of Broken Arrow, a community that Josiah had promised would offer refuge, but whose reception remained an agonizing unknown. They were fugitives on the run, stepping out of the forest and into the light of history, hoping to find a home in a land of exiles. The creek settlement of Broken Arrow emerged from the misty woodlands, not as a chaotic encampment, but as a structured testament to resilience, its log cabins and traditional winter houses arranged with deliberate order along the rolling ridges. The architectural fusion of European settlement styles and indigenous design principles created a visual dialect of adaptation, a physical manifestation of a people who had survived the Trail of Tears to rebuild their society in exile. Silas and his companions halted on the fringe of the tree line, the weight of their approach heavy in the damp air. They were no longer hidden by the vastness of the plains or the density of the cross timbers. Here, they were visible anomalies in a closely knit community that viewed strangers with unnecessary suspicion. As they entered the clearing, the reaction from the townspeople was immediate and layered. Children stopped their play in the narrow lanes, their eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear, while adults paused their work on the porches, their expressions hardening into masks of assessment. Silas walked his horse forward, his hands held openly at his sides, projecting a non-threatening deference that he had learned was the requisite posture of the powerless. The group's composition, a black man leading a party of fugitives accompanied by a wounded Kiowa warrior, defied the usual categories of drifters or traders, sparking a murmured wave of speculation that rippled through the gathering crowd. An older man dressed in a calico shirt and breechclout, his face bearing the dignified lines of authority, stepped forward to bar their path. This was Opoth Leahola, a prominent Creek diplomat and leader, known for his staunch defense of his people's sovereignty against the encroachments of the federal government. He spoke in the Muskogee language, his tone a low rumble that commanded instant attention. Walking Crow, leaning heavily on his lance, responded in a strained voice, explaining their flight from the iron trap. and the pursuit by the white militia. The linguistic barrier was a thick wall, but the universal language of injury and exhaustion bridged the gap, prompting Opothleyahula to gesture toward a central lodge, signaling a temporary truce for the purpose of council. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and herbs, a welcome reprieve from the biting dampness of the rainy season. Silas, Esther, and the others were offered seats on woven mats, a gesture of basic hospitality that felt momentous after weeks of sleeping on bare ground. The Creek Council members filed in, a mix of young men and elder women, representing the bicameral nature of their governance. Silas stood to recount their story, his voice steady as he detailed the escape from the Thornwood plantation, the mercy shown to Walking Crow, and the violent encounter at Harlan's farm. He presented the turquoise talisman given to him by the warrior, placing it on the dirt floor as evidence of the bond that transcended racial lines. The sight of the Kiowa talisman provoked a ripple of murmurs among the elders, recognizing it as a significant token of honor. Walking Crow spoke next, his words translated by a mixed-race trader present in the lodge, confirming Silas's account and declaring the debt of life that existed between them. He spoke of the brotherhood of the trap, a phrase that resonated with the Creek's own history of forced removal and alliance. The council debated in hushed tones, weighing the danger of harboring fugitives against the sacred obligation of sanctuary. The memory of their own displacement was still fresh, a collective trauma that inclined them toward empathy for the pursued. Opothleyahula raised his hand for silence, the room instantly obeying. He spoke in a slow, measured cadence, his eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to the soul. The trader translated the chief's words. The Creek people knew what it meant to be hunted like animals, to have their laws ignored by those who claimed to bring civilization. He declared that Silas and his group would be granted sanctuary under the protection of the Creek Nation, a decision rooted not in abstract charity, but in a shared recognition of oppression. The lodge exhaled a collective breath, the tension dissipating into a profound relief that left Silas momentarily light-headed. The integration into the life of Broken Arrow began the following day, a process of slow, tentative steps toward normalcy. Silas was assigned a small cabin on the edge of the village, a humble structure that represented the first true home he had ever possessed that was not a slave quarter. Esther and her son were taken in by a family of Creek freedmen who offered them clothes and a sense of community that the boy had never known. The transition was jarring, shifting from a constant state of flight to the rhythm of daily chores and communal meals, a sudden peace that felt fragile and dreamlike. Walking Crow's recovery took a significant turn for the better under the ministrations of the Creek healers, who applied poultices of medicinal roots that surpassed the crude treatments Silas had managed in the wilderness. The warrior's fever broke, and though his leg would forever bear the mark of the iron trap, he began to move with the aid of a crutch. His presence in the village was a curiosity, but the respect he commanded as a warrior who had defied the Texas militia smoothed his acceptance. Silas visited him daily, their conversations evolving from survival strategies to philosophical discussions about the future of their peoples. Weeks passed, and the biting autumn air gave way to the crisp chill of early winter, settling a blanket of frost over the roofs of Broken Arrow. Silas threw himself into the work of the village, chopping wood and helping to repair the stockade that surrounded the central council house. The physical labor was a balm, a way to quiet the restless anxiety that still lingered in his muscles. He was no longer working for a master's profit, but for the collective survival of a community that had accepted him as one of their own. This shift in purpose was transformative, forging a new identity that was neither purely African nor Creek, but a hybrid forged in the crucible of the frontier. The tranquility was shattered one gray afternoon by the thunderous approach of a column of riders, their blue coats and polished brass buttons standing out against the muted tones of the landscape. The federal delegation, led by a marshal from the Western District of Arkansas, rode into Broken Arrow with the arrogance of an occupying force. Accompanying them was Cornelius Thorne, his face set in a grim mask of determination, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd with a predator's focus. The long arm of the plantation had finally extended its reach into the sanctuary of the Indian Territory, turning the peaceful clearing into a stage for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Brotherhood of the Trap. Silas stood from his place by the woodpile, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt, though he knew it was useless against the carbines slung over the soldier's shoulders. Thorne pointed a gloved finger at Silas, his voice ringing out across the square, demanding the surrender of his property under the statutes of the Fugitive Slave Act. The marshal dismounted and presented a sheaf of papers to Opotleahola, documents that purported to grant him the authority to breach the sovereignty of the Creek Nation. The air grew thick with tension, the villagers reaching for their own weapons as the soldiers rested hands on their holsters, a single spark away from a massacre. Opotleahola refused to touch the papers, instead letting them drop from the marshal's hand into the mud, a symbolic rejection of the external authority. He stood tall, declaring in broken English that the laws of the United States held no power within the bounds of their treaty lands. The chief's defiance was a calculated gamble, banking on the federal government's reluctance to spark a wider war with the powerful Creek Nation over a single fugitive. The marshal's face reddened with anger, but the sight of the surrounding warriors, armed and impassive, forced him to reconsider the wisdom of an immediate assault. A tense standoff ensued, a war of words and wills that stretched into the evening. Thorne paced like a caged animal, his frustration boiling over as he realized his financial investment was slipping away. He offered bribes to the council, then threats of military intervention, but the Creek remained united, their solidarity unbroken by the pressure. Silas watched from the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding against his ribs, realizing that his fate was no longer in his own hands, but bound to the integrity of the alliance he had forged on the plains. The struggle for his freedom had evolved into a test of the Creek Nation's resolve, a microcosm of the larger battle for sovereignty that defined the era. The standoff in the center of Broken Arrow reached a breaking point as the federal marshal, his patience exhausted by the Creek Council's refusal to capitulate, motioned for his soldiers to ready their weapons. The metallic click of hammers being cocked echoed through the crisp winter air, a sound that signaled the transition from diplomatic dispute to imminent violence. Cornelius Thorne sat astride his horse, a smirk of anticipation darkening his features, seemingly convinced that the threat of force would crumble the resolve of the native defenders. The line of Creek warriors, however, did not flinch. They stood as a wall of discipline, their rifles trained on the blue-coated soldiers, with a precision that spoke of years of defending their borders against incursions far more severe than this legal posse. Just as the marshal opened his mouth to issue the command to fire, a collective roar erupted from the tree line to the south, a terrifying sound that froze the breath in the throats of the soldiers. A wave of painted warriors on horseback crested the ridge, their lances glinting in the pale sun, and their war cries tearing the silence of the afternoon. It was not a random war party, but a strategic deployment of Kiowa and Comanche allies, summoned by the signal fires that had been burning in the hills for days. The arrival of these reinforcements, a testament to the diplomatic reach of the Brotherhood, instantly inverted the power dynamic, encircling the federal detachment with a force that outnumbered them 3-1. Walking Crow stepped forward from the crowd, his limp pronounced but his bearing regal, positioning himself directly between Silas and the soldiers. He raised his voice, speaking in the trade language of the plains that many in the Creek and Kiowa contingents understood, demanding that the outsiders withdraw from the sovereign land of his allies. The sight of the Kiowa warrior, whom Thorn had presumed dead or broken, standing in defense of the fugitive, struck a blow to the plantation owner's certainty that was far more effective than any bullet. The irony was palpable. The savage and the slave stood united under the banner of law. Tribal law, while the representatives of civilization stood exposed as aggressors. The marshal, realizing that he had walked into a trap of his own making, sought to salvage the situation with a desperate bluster, claiming that the presence of the army would soon follow if blood was shed. Opothlayahola silenced him with a wave of his hand, declaring that the Creek nation would not be dictated to by men who could not honor their own treaties. The chief's voice carried the weight of history, reminding the federal agent that the Great Father in Washington had enough enemies on the frontier without adding the formidable might of the Creek and Kiowa Confederacy to the list. The bluff worked. The marshal, looking at the overwhelming numbers and the determination in the eyes of the warriors, ordered his men to stand down. Thorn, however, could not accept the defeat of his pride. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a concealed pistol from his coat and leveling it at Silas, with a scream of rage that bordered on madness. The act was a violation of the truce, a desperate gamble to reclaim his property by lethal force, if necessary. Time seemed to slow as Silas stood his ground, the weight of the turquoise talisman heavy against his chest, refusing to give his enemy the satisfaction of fear. Before Thorn could squeeze the trigger, 10 bears who had been silently tracking the plantation owner's movements from the flank lunged forward with a lance, striking the pistol from Thorn's hand and sending it spinning into the mud. The violence was contained in that single, decisive motion, a surgical strike that neutralized the threat without escalating into a massacre. Thorn was dragged from his horse by Creek warriors, his wrists bound with leather thongs, as he hurled curses that fell on deaf ears. The marshal, his face pale with the realization of how close he had come to a slaughter, pleaded for the release of his civilian companion. Opothlayahola consented to Thorn's release only on the condition that the entire party withdraw immediately from Creek territory and never return, a sentence of exile that Thorne had no choice but to accept. As the federal column retreated, trailing shame and dust in equal measure, the atmosphere in Broken Arrow shifted from tension to jubilation. The victory was not merely military, but moral. The Creek and their allies had successfully defended their sovereignty against the encroaching institution of slavery. Silas looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything for him. The stoic 10 Bears, the recuperating Walking Crow, the steadfast Esther, and the wise Opothlayahola. The bond forged in the iron jaws of the trap had been tested by fire and found unbreakable, a living refutation of the dehumanizing logic of the plantation system. In the days that followed, the political ramifications of the standoff began to ripple through the territory. News of the Broken Arrow incident spread through the trade routes and down the river systems, carrying with it the story of the Black Fugitive and the Kiowa warrior. Silas became a symbol of the possibility of resistance, a living challenge to the narrative that escape was impossible and alliance was unnatural. The Creek Council formally adopted Silas into the tribe, granting him the land rights and protections of a citizen, a legal status that the United States government would spend decades trying to dismantle through legislative chicanery. Silas, however, did not settle into the quiet life of a farmer. The network he had seen in operation, the Quakers, the native guides, the hidden stations, needed to be expanded and formalized. He dedicated himself to the Brotherhood of the Trap, establishing a network of scouts and messengers who could guide other fugitives from the cotton fields of Texas to the safety of the Indian Territory. His knowledge of the terrain, combined with his understanding of the cultural dynamics of the plains, made him an invaluable asset to the Underground Railroad's southernmost routes, transforming his personal quest for freedom into a collective struggle for liberation. Walking Crow, though his warrior days were limited by his injury, chose to remain with Silas as a permanent liaison between the fugitive communities and the Kiowa bands. Their friendship, born of blood and iron, became a cornerstone of the alliance, a daily reminder that the boundaries of race and culture were permeable when tested by the shared desire for liberty. They often sat by the fire in the evenings, speaking of the future, of the families they would reunite, and the system they would chip away at, one soul at a time. The legacy of the trap was not one of suffering, but of the enduring strength found in the choice to show mercy. The legend of Silas and Walking Crow grew with each passing year, passed down in the oral traditions of the Creek, the Kiowa, and the African American communities that dotted the banks of the Red River. It was a story that offered a counter-narrative to the simplistic histories of the frontier, revealing a landscape defined not just by conflict, but by cooperation. The Brotherhood of the Trap stood as a testament to the idea that the most profound revolutions often begin not with a declaration of war, but with a simple act of humanity in the face of overwhelming brutality. As Silas looked out over the settlement of Broken Arrow, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys into the vast open sky, he knew that the journey was far from over, but for the first time in his life, he was walking the path as a free man.